I parked outside the familiar brownstone, its windows glowing warmly in the early evening light, and took a deep breath. 32 years. That's how long my parents had been married. 32 years, and apparently, tonight, I was expected to celebrate them on someone else's terms. I smoothed my silk blouse, feeling the crisp fabric against my skin, trying to mask the nerves that still lingered from years of navigating their expectations. I stepped inside. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh herbs hit me instantly, mingling with the faint aroma of candles. The dining table gleamed under the chandelier, polished silver reflecting the laughter that was already rolling around the room. My parents were there, smiling, but something felt off. Everyone had finished eating. Everyone except me. Mom looked at me across the empty chair, her smile polite, almost rehearsed. Then, without warning, she extended a crisp envelope toward me. I froze. My name, in her neat handwriting, was on the front. Inside was a statement, a bill, $2,720. My heart skipped, then sank. I bit my lip, the metallic taste of tension sharp in my mouth. Is this for real? I whispered to myself, mostly to keep my voice steady. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Just waited, her eyes measuring me like I was an account to be balanced. And in that instant, I realized this wasn't about money. It was about control. About testing whether I had the courage to speak up, or whether I'd fold, like I used to. I touched the envelope lightly, my fingers trembling, trying to decide whether to throw it across the room or smile politely and leave. I remember the first time I truly clashed with my parents, though at the time, I didn't know it would shape my entire adult life. I was 22, fresh out of college, heart full of ambition, and desperate to prove I could make it on my own. I had saved every penny for my internship, taken on odd freelance projects, and even declined their helpful suggestions that I move back home. One evening, I came home with my latest paycheck in hand, proud of the work I had done. I thought they would be happy, maybe even impressed. Instead, my father looked at me over his reading glasses, lips tight. "You're wasting your time," he said. "You need a stable job, a real career, not these hobbies." My mother nodded, her expression soft but firm. "We just want you to be safe," she said, but the weight in her words was clear. Safe meant obedient, controlled, predictable. I felt the sting of rejection, like a slap I couldn't avoid. My hands shook as I set the paycheck on the table. "I don't need your approval," I said, my voice cracking, though I tried to steady it. "I can manage. I can do this on my own." My father scoffed, and my mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't intervene. It was the first time I realized that love from them came with strings, conditions I wasn't willing to accept. That night, I sat on my bed, clutching a small silver locket my grandmother had given me before she passed. "Trust yourself, Emily," her words echoed in my mind. "Your worth is not measured by their approval." I turned the locket over in my hands, feeling the cool metal against my fingers, and made a silent vow. I would leave. I would build something of my own, and I would never let anyone put a price on my dignity. The next morning, I packed my few belongings into my battered car and drove across state lines with no plan but determination. Each mile was a declaration. I would not let fear, or judgment, or outdated rules hold me down. The memory of their disapproving faces, the weight of their expectations, became fuel for my journey. I was leaving more than a house. I was leaving a life defined by their control, stepping into a world where I alone would define success. The first months after leaving home were brutal. I bounced between small apartments, took odd jobs that barely covered rent, and faced rejection after rejection. But with every no, I reminded myself of my grandmother's words, "Your worth is not measured by their approval." I clung to that locket like a talisman, a reminder that I was building something bigger than myself. I found a mentor almost by accident, a woman named Margaret, who ran a boutique marketing firm in Chicago. She was sharp, demanding, but she saw potential in me that I hadn't yet acknowledged in myself. "Emily," she said on our first meeting, "don't let anyone tell you your ideas aren't valuable. You'll fail, yes, but only if you let fear win." I nodded, barely able to hide my trembling hands, but her confidence seeped into me like sunlight through a window. Long nights became routine. I learned digital marketing, client management, and finance on the fly. I remember the smell of coffee and printer ink in my tiny office, the way my laptop felt warm against my knees as I worked until sunrise. I doubted myself constantly, wondering if my parents' warnings were true. Maybe I wasn't cut out for independence. But then I'd check my email to see a client praising a campaign I'd poured my heart into, and a spark of pride would flare, burning away the lingering self-doubt. Small victories accumulated. My first profitable project, a local bakery's online campaign, earned more than I'd ever seen in one paycheck. The second client doubled that. Slowly, I began saving, investing, and most importantly, believing that I could create a life without their approval. I became deliberate about keeping my success hidden. On social media, I posted generic updates, a coffee with friends, a city skyline, a vague, hard work paying off caption. I avoided sending holiday cards or updates to my parents that might reveal how far I had come. I didn't want them to know. I wanted my success to be mine alone, earned without conditions, without judgment. By the time I turned 28, I had built a boutique consultancy with multiple clients, a small team, and a steady income that surpassed anything I had imagined. I decorated my apartment with pieces I loved, a gallery wall of abstract art, lush plants by the window, a sleek desk where I spent hours strategizing campaigns. Every item was a reminder. I built this.
No one did it for me.
And yet, despite the freedom and stability, there was a lingering question I couldn't shake. How would my family react if they saw me now? The girl they once scolded for daring to dream was no longer that girl. I was stronger, smarter, financially independent. And the thought of confronting them, on my terms, sent a thrill through me, mingled with the old, familiar fear of their disapproval. I walked into the grand hall of my parents' favorite restaurant, the one they'd reserved for their 32nd anniversary. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, throwing fractured light across the polished wooden floors. Laughter and the clinking of silverware filled the space, and the scent of roasted meats and buttered vegetables lingered in the air. My parents sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed, flanked by siblings and distant relatives. Everyone had finished eating, everyone except me. Mom's polite smile faltered the moment she saw me standing there. My heels clicked softly on the floor as I approached, the sound punctuating the tension I could feel in the room. She extended the envelope again, the $2,720 bill, and I took it, feeling the weight of their expectations press against my chest. I glanced around. Their eyes were a mix of anticipation and judgment, the same mix I remembered from years ago when I had dared to defy them. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel small. I took a slow breath, savoring the moment, and then, deliberately, I set the envelope down on the table. Mom, Dad, I began, my voice calm, measured, carrying the confidence I had earned over years of struggle. I think it's time you understood what I've been doing all these years. Their eyes narrowed, curiosity mixed with apprehension. I gestured toward the table around me, at the people who expected me to be meek, the familiar setting that had been so carefully curated. You've been handing me bills and expectations, testing my obedience, judging my choices. But while you were measuring my worth in dollars and rules, I've been building something that can't be measured by a check. I pulled out my tablet from my bag and swiped through the dashboard of my consultancy firm, client portfolios, revenue streams, and growth charts. My parents leaned forward involuntarily, their polite composure slipping. This, I said, letting my fingers linger on the screen, is my company. I'm the founder. I manage a team of 15, have multiple clients, and an annual revenue that more than covers any imaginary bill you could write me. My father's mouth opened, then closed, as if the words he wanted to say were trapped behind decades of rigid thinking. My mother's hands trembled slightly, a flash of shame and disbelief crossing her face. My siblings stared, stunned, realizing that the girl they thought they knew, the obedient, dependent Emily, had been secretly unstoppable all along. I didn't stop there. I described my apartment, my investments, my financial independence. I told them about the nights I had cried alone, the countless hours of learning and working, the sacrifices made to build a life where I owed nothing to anyone but myself. Every word landed like a gentle, precise hammer, dismantling years of assumptions. The room fell silent. Not the polite, controlled silence of a family dinner, but the heavy, raw silence of realization. They were no longer the gatekeepers of my life. They were witnesses to it. And I let them feel it. I let them sit with the truth that I had grown, thrived, and succeeded, entirely on my own terms. I smiled, not out of malice, but out of quiet triumph. "So," I said, leaning back in my chair, "if you were expecting me to pay a bill for being born, I think the accounts are settled. I built myself. That's what matters." Their faces, a mixture of awe, guilt, and astonishment, confirmed it. The powerless girl they remembered was gone. And in her place stood someone unshakable, untouchable, and fully realized. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of my success settle into the space between us. The room felt charged, heavy with the realization that I was no longer the child they could control. For the first time in decades, the dynamic had shifted, and I was the one holding the cards. "I'm not here to humiliate you," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But I am here to set some boundaries." My parents exchanged glances, unsure whether to brace themselves or protest. "If we're going to have a relationship moving forward," I continued, "it has to be on terms that respect me, my choices, and my independence." I laid out my conditions carefully, one by one. First, financial responsibility. No more arbitrary demands or bills sent my way. If they wanted support or gifts, it would be mutually agreed upon, not imposed. Second, honesty and transparency. I would no longer tolerate passive-aggressive judgments disguised as concern. Third, they had to allow me to make my own decisions, big or small, without interference or guilt. "But it's not just about me," I added, softening slightly. "It's about you too." I suggested ways they could grow. Mom could finally take that painting class she'd always postponed. Dad could pursue the hobby he abandoned decades ago. "I want you to find your own fulfillment," I said, without leaning on me for validation or control. I watched carefully as they absorbed the conditions, gauging their reactions. My father shifted uncomfortably, but his eyes softened, a flicker of understanding emerging. Mom's hands, once tense, relaxed slightly on the table. My siblings, previously skeptical, nodded subtly, realizing that this wasn't punishment. It was clarity, a chance for the family to recalibrate. I made it clear that compliance was voluntary, but non-negotiable for continued closeness. "I love you all," I said, letting warmth thread through my words. But love isn't blind obedience. It's respect, understanding, and growth. If we can't have that, I'll step back. And I've learned, the hard way, that stepping back is sometimes necessary to protect yourself. The room felt lighter after that. Not suddenly perfect, not suddenly healed, but charged with potential. They weren't just my parents anymore. They were partners in a new dynamic, one that allowed me to thrive without fear, without shame. I felt a strange relief seeing them consider their own lives, their own growth, rather than attempting to dictate mine. For the first time in years, I realized that power wasn't about money, authority, or control. It was about choice, the ability to define your life and insist on boundaries. And now, finally, they could see it. Not as a threat, not as a challenge, but as a blueprint for a healthier, more balanced family. The weeks that followed were quiet, but transformative. My parents, once rigid and unyielding, began small acts of change. Mom signed up for that painting class she'd always postponed, her eyes lighting up as she shared a photo of her first canvas. Dad dusted off his old guitar and played a shaky but joyful tune one evening, the sound echoing through the house in a way that felt like freedom. Even my siblings started making choices without seeking permission, inspired by the boundaries I had set. I watched all of it from my own apartment, the same one where I had worked late nights, cried quietly, and built a life piece by piece. My locket, worn smooth by years of worry and hope, rested in my hand. I traced its edges, remembering my grandmother's words. Your worth is not measured by their approval. They had guided me, challenged me, hurt me, but ultimately, it was my determination, my choices, and my resilience that shaped the woman I had become. When I finally returned for family dinner, it was different. There was laughter, yes, but also respect, curiosity, and warmth untainted by judgment. I realized I could love them, and let them love me, without losing myself. The power I had fought for wasn't just about financial independence or career success. It was about emotional freedom, about creating relationships that honored who I was. I smiled, glancing at the table where my family gathered. No envelopes, no tests, no conditions, just shared meals, conversation, and a tentative but growing understanding. I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years, a quiet pride in the life I had carved out for myself. And in that moment, I whispered, mostly to myself, but enough for the air to catch it. I am enough, and I always was. The woman who once trembled at their expectations had become someone unshakable, compassionate, and unapologetically herself. I had faced their control, their judgments, and emerged not only victorious, but whole. And for the first time, I could enjoy the fullness of my own life, the independence I had fought for, the relationships I had redefined, and the peace I had earned.